This call is now being recorded.
So you mentioned how you clearly defined how perceived exploitation is perception. It might not necessarily be true exploitation. And later on, toward the end of the paper, you say it certainly is possible that employees' subjective perceptions of exploitation are more imagined than real, making addressing employees' perceptions and causal attributions appropriate. So tell me a little bit about that, the difference between, you also talk about, slavery and serfdom and perceived exploitation. So can you give me the range of what perceived exploitation could be from the organization's and employees' point of view?
Yes. So in our background literature, we describe, various forms of exploitation and how, in our mind, we view exploitation as a very extreme form. We can think about, slavery, very extreme forms of exploitation. What we argue is that exploitation is occurring also more implicitly in organizations that we don't necessarily think of as exploitive. And our idea here was to try to understand perceptions as opposed to objective exploitation. Now, these perceptions can be rooted in real exploitation, which we can measure, in various ways. But what we argue is that the perceptions are more important than actual exploitation, because if someone perceives themselves as exploited, then they will experience the results or the outcomes behaviorally, attitudinally towards the organization, regardless of whether they are not being exploited, as this is what they perceive.
And so that's the key for organizations and managers who don't think they're being exploitive at all. They have to keep in mind that might not be the point. The point might be that your employees still feel that way and then have these reactions that you just mentioned.
Exactly. Exactly right. So even though you may be paying a good salary, right, these perceptions can develop still. And managers and organizations need to be aware of these perceptions, which can be a root cause of many kind of detrimental behaviors or attitudes towards the organization. We can talk about, burnout, turnover, reduced organizational commitments, etc.
Right, and you broke that out clearly. Anger and hostility and the things they can lead to, and shame and guilt and the things they can lead to, and I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yes.
So, also one line from the paper, he said, right after you mentioned slavery and serfdom, more subtle forms of employee exploitation that exist today across, they should not blind us to the various and more subtle forms of exploitation that exist today across many countries and industries. So can you give me some examples of the real subtle forms of exploitation?
Yes. So when we provide, for example, no security in certain jobs, right, this may lead to employees' perceptions of exploitation. And this is very different from very clear forms like slavery. Okay, so this is not necessarily something that that is obvious. Okay, if we're thinking about within organizations, or if we look at the medical residents that we researched for this paper, we can see that this is not exactly a group that we would expect necessarily to be exploited. This is an implicit type of exploitation, because we kind of explained their perceptions of exploitation in the fact that they have a certain expectation for what their careers would be like, and then there's a gap between that and reality, and that in itself is enough to cause these perceptions to develop. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a category of people that we think might be more susceptible. Oh, hold on, sorry, I'm just on an important call and I need to concentrate. So can you come back in a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry, it's just distracting, and thank you. No worries. I have someone here fixing our equipment. So,
Problem. So, for example,
yeah.
that's a good example, and in many ways, it's physicians, maybe because of their compensation and the respect they get, you wouldn't think of them as thinking that they're exploited. Yet, you said that the reason might be because of the gap between their expectations and reality. Now,
exactly.
Later on, you talk about some things organizations can do to check and kind of take the pulse of their employees to see if they feel that way. But in that specific regard, you just mentioned about the gap between expectations and reality. Is that something that maybe organizations might need to be more explicit about, what this job really is? That it might be you might be working 16 hours a day for years and be on call for your days off.
This setting the expectations straight at first is something important. And I think it can definitely help alleviate some of the perceptions that develop later. However, the literature shows that even then, right, even when expectations are set straight at first, sometimes the reality is still different. And we can think of, I don't know if you're familiar with the literature, I'm sure you are, on psychological contract breach, right? People have this expectation of what their life in the organization might look like. Sorry?
I'm sorry. No, I'm not familiar with that. And keep in
okay.
mind, I'm writing with, we're creating this for managers and business leaders. So, just so you know, I'm a
less theoretical. Yeah. Less theoretical. Got it.
Anything applicable is fine to talk about, but don't make assumptions about
right.
the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So
Got it.
It's very simple, but go on with that, please, but don't make any assumptions was my point.
But before we kind of come to solutions, before I forget, I want to add a point that when we're talking about exploitation, this doesn't necessarily have to manifest itself in compensation or salary. It can also manifest itself in other ways. For example, the time invested that you expect to invest on the job, or even things like respect or lack thereof that you get from your employer. These can also end up as feelings of exploitation. So if you look at kind of some of our items to measure exploitation, you'll see that it ranges beyond just the distributive element of it. Okay, so it's not necessarily only monetary.
Right. So I was going to, at the end, as an example, use. So I'm not going to get deep into the methodology, other than very basic to show that this is science, not speculation.
Right.
So
right.
But at the bottom, I was going to use Table A1, all 14 statements that they, agreed with or disagreed on the 7-point scale as an example, so the reader knows, how you measured how people felt, whether they were exploited. I thought that was Table A1 was a good example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right,
okay,
right,
good.
exactly. Now, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list.
Right.
But it is what we found. Originally, the list that we looked at was much wider and included many other aspects. However, these didn't pass our scrutiny. They didn't pass our statistical tests. So these are the items that we were left with in terms of their kind of reliability and validity.
But I thought this list was good, not just because it was long, but these are kind of things, anecdotally, you might hear a colleague or a neighbor talk about their job when they're complaining. Some of these sentences are things that someone would say to say that
right.
they yeah.
And the way we came up with this list was through interviews, right? We interviewed many people, working people in different professions, different industries, and that's how we came up with our initial list of what constitutes exploitation in the organizational context, in these implicit forms of exploitation. Sometimes more explicit than others, but as well implicit.
So I just want to double check some numbers too in the methodology. So the first study you called a validation study, that was among 186 U.S. workers. Is that number correct?
The U.S., do you mean the MTurk? Yes, the validation. Hold on, let me just go back to this to make sure we're talking about the same one.
Are you looking at the PDF?
Yes.
Page 23 at the bottom.
Okay. Oh, okay. So wait, I think we might be looking at different versions here. My page
I
23,
have the PDF that's the R2 version that was online.
Okay. No, I'm looking at a different version. Sorry, hold on.
If you search
Okay,
on
so
186,
the validation study that included the MTurk participants, so
yeah.
this is like an online study, just to make sure it's the MTurk one, which you can check later. So this was intended to see if basically there's a necessity for another construct in the literature. So there are already different concepts that capture kind of negative treatment from the organization. We wanted to see if we are capturing something that hasn't yet been captured. And what we found was that indeed we're capturing something that has not yet been captured. One of the reasons is that it predicts different outcomes. Okay, for example, our concept, perceived exploitation, predicted the emotions of anger and hostility and shame and guilt above and beyond what any other existing concept predicts. So basically the validation study helps us say, yes, this construct is something valid, it's something needed, because it taps into something that hasn't been tapped into before.
Got it. And that was among 186 U.S. workers.
So when you say U.S., I think this is the MTurk study you're referring to, but let me just confirm that.
Yeah. I take that of the 186 completed surveys, and then later on it had N equals 186. And then in the same paragraph, a diverse range of professions and industries were represented in the sample.
Yeah. So that's MTurk. I think they're mostly American.
Okay.
I think they're like, because it's an online platform, but hold on, let me just double check that. They are mostly American, but maybe not solely. But for some reason,
that's good. 186 among mostly U.S. workers. I'll clarify that because that's why I was asking about that.
Okay. Hold on. We may have just used for this research. I have to double check with my co-author whether we just used, part of the sample. But hold on to have it more standardized. But let me 186 American U.S. Is this something I can get back to you on to clarify? Okay.
I'm going to send it to your review. And the reason I go through these now, even though you're going to review them, these little details about methodology, it's nice to get on the same page now so you don't have to worry about doing it later.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure,
though I'm pretty sure it's because of different professions that we are talking about the same thing. I believe it's the MTurk. And what we may have done is, if there were maybe 5% of the respondents were kind of international, then we may have scrapped those just to have a consistent sample. But I'm not sure about that, to have a U.S.-based sample. But I'm not actually sure. I'll have a look at that again.
I'll be writing it now, 186 among mostly U.S. workers. So if it turns out they're all U.S., just you kill among mostly.
Mostly U.S. or all U.S. Let me double check that and get back to you. Yes, I can't remember off the top of my head.
And study one was 219 surveys at a UK construction firm.
Yes.
And
That's
study
right.
two was 139 medical doctors in the U.S., UK, and Israel.
That's right.
And that included 2 surveys with a 3-month time lag.
That's right.
Help ensure they'd still be in the same place.
This was more for our statistical analysis, for the purposes of our statistical analysis, because we wanted to come closer to causality. This is a statistical thing that, you can't really say one thing causes the other. But if you have time data, then you can make kind of more causal attributions. You can, you can say, you can also check for things like reverse causality. You can rule out, what causes what if you have, more than one point in time. So this was more for kind of statistical purposes, I would say.
Okay. Now I'm getting back to about whether or not the exploitation is real or perceived. You noted whether imagined or structurally real. Once established, employees' perceptions that their organizations are exploitative will be difficult to reverse, as those who have studied breaches of workplace trust or injustice note those perceptions are difficult to change. So can you tell me a little bit about that? I think you started to before.
Yes. So there's a lot of research on negative events versus positive events, or negative relationships versus positive relationships. So while a positive relationship takes sometimes a longer time to build up, right, because we have to create trust between us, and this might take a long time. Some research shows that actually, a negative event can hurt the relationship in a downward spiral much quicker than I hope I'm explaining myself correctly. So what I'm trying to say is negative events are much more detrimental than positive events are positive. I hope that makes sense. So
I have a bad experience at work. That's going to last with me and stick with me and affect me longer than the positive.
Exactly. Say, and you can think of it simply: if you get positive feedback from your boss, you're happy, right? But if you get very negative or harsh feedback from your boss, you're going to be a lot more unhappy than you were happy from the positive feedback. So exactly what you described.
So I guess what that implies, and the thing is, the key for managers and organizations is don't let things go so employees feel this way, feel like they're being exploited. Correct?
Well, it's hard to say because they may not know that they feel this way. So I think, from a practical standpoint, how can organizations address this is a good question. I'm not arguing I have the right answer, but I think being aware of this, trying to understand where employees stand, you can do this various ways, through surveys, through one-on-one discussions or interviews. You can try to get a feel for where you should encourage, this feedback, because the next time you're going to hear about it is when they say, I quit, So definitely to encourage such feedback is something that could be beneficial for organizations, as long as they have a culture that's really open to it. Because, you might say, we're open to hearing about this, but then you're not really. Once you hear negative feedback from your employees, start arguing with them. But that's not true. But look how much you earn, right?
Yeah.
And kind of the genesis of this project was, speaking to employees in finance and seeing some of their crazy hours that they were working around the clock. But when you talk to some of them, do you feel you're being exploited? They would say, especially if they're in kind of entry-level employees, they think to themselves, no way. And, in a few years' time, I'll be making an X amount of money, and I won't be exploited. So basically this idea of deferring or kind of taking a beat up now for future. Maybe don't use the word beat up because I'm trying to find kind of words that are more relatable. But having a challenge now for future benefits may alleviate the sense of exploitation, because this is what we saw with some people in finance, that they felt that even though right now they're working overtime, they're maybe being exploited in that sense. Maybe they don't, perceptions of exploitation do not develop necessarily because of this future promise for compensation.
But even in that situation, wouldn't it be wise for an organization to, like you said, survey its employees on these issues, have non-performance related, like 360-degree interviews on these issues, just to keep in touch with anything that could arise?
Absolutely. And this is kind of, you'll see in our recommendations for organizations section that we absolutely think that organizations can help prevent this. And even though it's harder to amend, a negative relationship once it's formed, it's still possible. And I think the very fact that organizations will express their willingness to hear feedback from employees is already in itself a step in the right direction in terms of alleviating a sense of exploitation. Being heard is something that's crucial.
And I think, tell me if this is correct, that one key to that, though, is like you said, making sure or doing your best to make sure people feel that the employee or organization is actually open to these comments. Because I've seen when organizations do such even anonymous surveys, people say, well, they know our IP address. They still know who's saying what.
Right, exactly. So it needs to be not just, English is not my mother tongue, paying lip service is the phrase I was looking for, but it actually has to, something has to be behind it. Employees need to believe that if they're heard, then, what they're saying will be acted on.
I'm just out of curiosity, what's your native language?
Oh, it's Hebrew.
I wouldn't have known.
Oh, really?
You sound perfectly fluent to me, I guess.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I've been, living abroad for many, many years. So, but thank you. I appreciate that. Still, every now and then, a phrase escapes me and I have to kind of think about it longer.
I don't think the accent is there at all. It just might be idiom that, is, particularly very.
Yes.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm not asking you about, anger and hostility and those things and shame and guilt and the things they lead to, because it's very, very clear how you wrote it. But I did have a question about that. So just what we're talking about, how, it might behoove organizations to survey their employees, have managers interview the people they supervise. Is it also possible that they need to separate the anger and hostility and those things that follow it and the shame and guilt, or is that not an issue, or one or the other? Does that come into play at all?
What do you mean by separate it?
Well, say focus. So I'm crafting a survey for my organization to send out to its employees. Should I be focusing on the anger and hostility, and then revenge, engagement, commitment, looking for another job?
Well, these can be indications. These can be indications that employees feel exploited. So I mean, how you ask the questions is also something very important. I don't know how it works within organizations, but for our surveys, we don't directly ask about it. And sometimes employees might feel very uncomfortable with that word. Organizations might feel uncomfortable with just putting that idea in their employees' minds.
Yeah.
So these can be indications of, especially feelings of anger and hostility. This can be an indication that employees have these bad feelings.
So you said the behavior. So if I was worried about, silence, the question might be, do you feel like you have to, or do you withhold ideas or information sometimes as a result of, or just ask that question? Because it's the behaviors they're trying to get to.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to think about how a potential survey would look. In an a survey that an organization might administer to its employees, which is different from what we did,
Right.
Because organizations have to be careful. Employees might not want to reveal their true kind of emotions to their boss, to their organization. So we'd have to think carefully how to craft such a survey. So it's hard for me to answer that right now, but I can certainly think about, how a survey like that could look like. With the silence, I mean, there are other causes, there are other underlying causes for some of these outcomes. Okay, for turnover intentions, right, commitment or lack thereof, silence, there are other reasons. For example, if you look at team-based organizational structures, right, often people don't speak their minds because of group dynamics, and it's not necessarily perceptions of exploitation. So, crafting a survey like that or constructing it to really capture perceptions of exploitation and nothing else, or, control for other things, would be something that organizations would really have to consider how to do.
I see. One other phrase in the paper, we document the commonness of employees' perceptions that organizations are exploiting them. So within the studies, was there a percentage of the people surveyed who, expressed feelings of being exploited that can be cited?
Yeah, what we were looking at was averages, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we had a scale from, I have to check if it's 1 through 5 or 1 through 7, right? The degree to which you feel exploited. Now, we didn't use that word, right? We used other words, or you saw our questionnaire. And then we looked at averages, right? So the higher the averages, the more these employees feel exploited on average. So you're always going to get ones that are more and ones that are less, but we're looking at averages. And what we found was that, for example, in the doctor sample, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll have to check that, I think the average of perceptions of exploitation was higher than in the construction sample. So that was an interesting finding.
You don't know the two numbers?
I have to look it up. Let me see if it's even here. It should be in this paper, actually. Let me just quickly find it.
Yes, I was looking for it too. I couldn't find it.
In the correlations matrix, this is a validation study, so no. This is, the MTurk was actually lower, and the mean here I see is 2.8. I have to check if it's out of 5 or out of 7 as well. Let me quickly look at that. Here, for study 1, it was 3.16, so higher than the MTurk sample. Okay, and this was the construction. Okay, and let me see the last one. Yeah, the mean was 325. So the average, right, 325, and I said 316 before.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just double check. Yeah. So basically, from all our samples, the medical residents felt the most exploited. Now, to say that this is, they felt very highly exploited, not necessarily, but there were enough people saying that they were exploited, and there's a difference between the perceptions of medical residents being exploited versus construction workers, or the MTurk sample, which is mixed kind of different industries.
Mm-hmm.
There's enough of a difference to say, well, there's something here. So I thought, so there were enough people that responded that they felt exploited. Yes, it was more prevalent than to be honest, we expected, especially
and
with the medical resident sample. Now, we have to say there's a caveat, which is, they're in different contexts. So the medical residence was in 3 different countries, but the construction sample was only in England. So maybe that had an effect, So I'd be wary. We don't discuss this, that the average or the mean of employees feeling exploited in the medical resident sample was higher than in the construction sample. We don't discuss that, but I think it's an interesting finding.
I see.
I don't know if that is something you want to mention or not. We don't discuss it really in the article.
I wanted to move on to one last question I have. I'm cognizant of our time.
On what, sorry?
I'm cognizant of our time. I didn't want to take up too much time.
Yeah. Oh, no worries. That's okay. Please go ahead.
So you're giving an elevator speech to a manager or business leader about the key takeaway or takeaways from your article. What would you say?
It's a very good question. Give me a second to think about that, because usually our elevator speech is to other researchers.
Right.
Yeah.
Just a leader in an organization who need information they need to know from your findings. Yes.
Okay, I would say, this is a bit repeating what we've kind of said.
That's I understand that. Completely.
I'd say that more employees than you'd think perceive themselves as exploited by the organization, even if that organization isn't objectively exploiting them. And these perceptions have outcomes. They have consequences. They can be both emotional, like anger and hostility and shame and guilt, but they also have behavioral consequences that are detrimental to the organization. And managers and organizations should pay attention to these perceptions and try to A, prevent them from developing, or B, try to curb them once they occur, in order to improve the relationship between employees and employers, and to alleviate these kind of negative outcomes, both for the individual employee and for the organization.
That's great, Ofer, and I think you can see why. I know we went over all these elements, but that's why I asked that question. That's a great synthesis and puts it all in a nutshell, and that's why I asked that question at the end.
Yeah. I think that's probably kind of the elevator pitch.
That was really good.
Yeah.
So I have no other questions. Do you have any questions for me?
I don't think so. What I can ask my co-authors if there's any point they want to get across that maybe I didn't mention, and also I need to get back to you on the sample, whether it was all U.S. or like 95% U.S. I can't remember, and I have to check that. So you can cite it correctly.
Yeah, you can do all that when I send you the summary to review.
Okay.
That's easier. So, and usually I can get that to you. It usually takes a week or two because of the other things I'm doing with Insights, the website and everything and promotion. But so I'd have it to you in a week or two, and it sounds like you could talk to your co-authors about that at that point. So they have it right in front of them, and it's not abstract about what you're talking about.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay. And again, I really apologize for this morning. So I'm glad we managed to talk.
I was assuming you didn't want to do the interviews, so don't worry about it.
Oh, no. I do. I'm glad we did.
Yeah, me too. So, like I said, I'll get this to you in a week or two. Whatever you decide and incorporate into the summary, just send me one copy back so I'm not left to potentially
no, you got it.
Contradictory comments or anything.
Oh, no problem. Yeah.
And like I said, when we get it back, it would be live in late this month or late next month, and then it would be in the newsletter that follows immediately afterward. Okay, fantastic. I look forward to seeing it then and before for the final draft. Well, so that's great. Thank you for your time and your thoughtful responses. I really appreciate it. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for taking interest in this. I appreciate it too. All right. All right. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. Thank you very much for taking interest in this. I appreciate it too. All right. All right. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. Thank you very much for taking interest in this. I appreciate it too. All right.